Welcome to Takeshi's Bench, where you can discuss all things philosophical. In this episode, I'd like to respond to a great question that I received from one of the viewers. That is, do you have any advice for students in high school considering studying philosophy? This question was given by Paul from Baguio, Philippines. This is a great question because it makes us ask the most philosophical question of why. Why should we even study philosophy? So the purpose of this episode is to respond to this question of why should we study philosophy, especially for high school students. Why should they study philosophy in high school? Or if they decided to go to college or universities after their graduation from high school, why should they major in philosophy or why should they take philosophy classes? So to answer this question given by Paul, I'd like to make 2 points in this episode. First, I'd like to talk about the idea of philosophy. So, what is it that we study in the discipline of philosophy, or what do we do when we study philosophy? Just to give you an idea of what philosophy is about. And then I would like to talk about the side effect, especially the positive effect of learning philosophy. So, first, the idea of philosophy. So, first question we have to ask is, what does it study? So, what does a student of philosophy actually study in their philosophy classes? The shortest answer to the most difficult question is this. The discipline of philosophy focuses on the examination of the idea of self and the world. Philosophers are actually there to examine the notion of the self and the world, and sometimes we examine the interrelation. So what does it mean for me to be who I am, the sense of self? Or what constitutes the idea of who I am? And what is the worldview in which we actually embrace this notion of self? Or what is the worldview in which we are confronted with this notion of self? Now, you notice this is very abstract. All philosophers are trying to examine the notion of the self in the world, but what are they? They are not like any other disciplines in academia, right? So let's contrast that with other disciplines just to give you a little bit more concrete picture of what philosophy is about. So, for instance, if you pay attention to the discipline of biology, biologists examine living organisms, right? So you have discipline and object of study. Art, if you think about art, it examines paintings and sculptures and many things that we call artworks. Of course, in the discipline of art, you have two ways, right? The one side is more focused on the practice of art, so you are trained to become painters and sculptors. And on the other side, you are trained to study the history of art and the discipline of art. But basic principle is that it is going to examine what is considered to be artistic. Economics. Economics is the social science that studies the production and consumption of goods and services. So it is about supply and demand of what is considered to be the goods or commodities in the world. So each discipline has its own object of study. Whether it is natural science or social science or humanities, they tend to have specific object of study. So literature studies the history of literature. French literature, they specifically focus on texts written in French language. But the discipline of philosophy doesn't have a particular object of study. It is actually driving to incorporate other perspectives because they're going to say biology, art, economics, any different disciplines are particular ways in which we're trying to know what we are and what the world is. So in a way, philosophy is more comprehensive and cross-disciplinary than all the others in principle. Because philosophy is the foundation of all the different kinds of knowledge, and from that process of knowing the self and knowing the world, we started to cultivate these different particular disciplines that focuses on particular object of study. So the discipline of philosophy is not any of the particular disciplines in a way, but they are comprehensive and foundational approach to the knowledge of the self and the world. Now, it might still be difficult to understand what philosophy is or what philosophy actually studies. So let me give you a little bit more descriptions. The discipline of philosophy is about the study of presuppositions. So for instance, when you make a statement or when you make any value or cultural judgments, philosophers are going to come in and say, what are the presuppositions by which we are making these statements? So that philosophical examination is in fact applicable to any disciplines in the field of academia. So for instance, if pay attention to art and paintings, right? The relationship between art and paintings in the discipline of art is quite clear, but from a philosophical perspective, we are going to ask questions like, what are the presuppositions when we say this object is art, but this object isn't? right? So sometimes you go to Museum of Modern Art and you started to wonder why pots and pans are considered to be art, or why interior design is considered to be a part of art. Is graffiti art, right? So these are the questions that philosophers would ask to the discipline of art. What are the presuppositions by which we make this kind of statement that these objects are artistic? Philosophers also examine the frameworks in which we make any academic statements. So let's say economics measure distributions and consumption of goods. But we started to ask questions of what counts as consumption, what counts as distribution, what are the frameworks in which we are making definitions about these important terms in the discipline of economics. So in a way, presuppositions and frameworks, we pay attention to the white line. Do you see this white line? That connects the discipline and object of the study. That is philosophical questioning. Okay. Also, we pay attention to the interrelations. So for instance, when you have religious studies, and then we are examining certain religious writings and religious rituals and religious narratives about the world, right? And then you have a scientist examining the physical phenomena of the world, and they are making certain statements about how the world is. And sometimes we have these conflicts between two perspectives. Scientists are saying one thing, and a religious studies specialist are saying another thing. And how do we negotiate what counts as scientific truth and what counts as religious truth? And where do we draw the line between science and religion, for instance? That boundary between two different disciplines are philosophical interrelations. So philosophers come in and say, from here, that's religion, but from here, that is science. For example, of course, this can apply to any disciplines whatsoever. For instance, you can talk about biology and how the world of living organisms are organizing themselves and what part of it is considered to be artistic expressions. So for instance, landscape, that is a little bit of crossover between two different disciplines. So philosophers are not only about the frameworks and presuppositions that are held in each particular disciplines, but we also pay attention to the interrelations between different particular disciplines. Also, we examine these implications. For instance, when we talk about economics examined again the distribution and consumption of the goods. And then when we see the world from the perspective of economics, do we miss something that is actually there? Is there something that we cannot exhaustively explain away from the perspective of economics? Or does the art have a value that cannot be measured by the price tag that we put on these artworks? They're very expensive, right? So there is interrelations between art and economics, but where do we draw the line to accurately assess the value of artworks? So for instance, these are the kind of interrelations and implications that we can study in the discipline of philosophy. So philosophy is not a specific discipline that you can study, or we can't give a specific object of study. If we ought to name the specific object, it's the self and the world, but they are a very broad and comprehensive topic. So that is to say, the discipline of philosophy is comprehensive in a sense that it is not any of the specific perspectives, but it pertains to all different disciplines. To prove this point, if you pay attention to the academic hierarchy, the highest degree that you can get from any disciplines is called PhD, right? And PhD stands for Doctors of Philosophy. That is to say, if you have a PhD in biology, you're a type of person who can account for the whole of the discipline of biology. You have to be a type of person who can give us a clear picture of what are the presuppositions and frameworks by which they are operating their examination of living organisms. They have to be also accountable for the interrelations between their discipline and other disciplines, as well as what is the good of having this discipline in our society, right? So what is the social ethical implication of this discipline to the society in which we are sponsoring this discipline? So in principle, anybody who perfects the knowledge of a particular discipline and reach the point where they can account for these presuppositions and frameworks and interrelations and implications, they are all philosophers. So let's talk about some examples to give you a little bit more concrete picture of what philosophical questions are and what are the type of questions that we ask in philosophy classes. The first question we often ask, and we have asked in this episode, is this question of what counts as X. So, for instance, in relation to the discipline of biology, we can ask the question of what counts as life or living organisms, and at what point we can say that organisms is no longer living. So, the distinction between life and death, that is a philosophical question. I also heard from Paul that he's asking this question to his high school students in his medical chemistry class. Right? So that is a topic that touches on both chemistry and medicine. He asked this question of at what point a certain chemical compound is considered to be a medicine and not poison. So what is the boundary between drug that cures the problems or considered to be the medicine that alleviates the health problems, or substance that is considered to be dangerous for the public health? When we create chemical compound, we form a committee, and that committee decides whether or not this chemical compound, this specific chemical compound, is beneficial for the good of the society, right? So you have many board members making these decisions, but there's not a single drug that is healthy for everyone who is going to take this medicine. There's always a side effect. There's a certain percentage of the population is always affected by the medicine in a negative manner. At what point can we say it is ethical to prescribe this chemical compound as a medicine? And at what point we say this is actually poisonous to the society? Okay, that is a kind of philosophical question. Another question we ask is how can we ground why? So for instance, we talk about human rights. But when we have different cultural values, so some societies are religious, some societies are secular, but having diverse cultural backgrounds, how do we ground the legitimacy of this universal claim? The claim that the human rights is applicable to all human beings regardless of their cultural, economic, socio-linguistic differences. Another thing, gender equality. How do we actually account for the fundamental rights for women and gender equality between men and women when we face diverse cultural backgrounds? How do we actually endorse and encourage this worldview while sometimes one society to another have this whole issue of colonialism? How do we reconcile fundamental rights of all women with inequality between Anglo-European women and minority women, for instance? So how do we reconcile different worldviews to claim something fundamental, claim something universal, and how do we ground these rights regardless of the differences that we face in our everyday life? That is a philosophical question. Third question, what's the point of Z at all? So sometimes when you live your life, you encounter the situations, you started to ask this question of what's the point of doing this at all? I'm pretty sure you experienced that a lot in high school, but many of us experience this throughout the life. Right? We believed that something was meaningful, but at some point you started to realize, is this really meaningful? Or sometimes you see a phenomena that looks contradictory. Or sometimes you see a statement that doesn't seem to make any sense. And in fact, it's ironic and funny, right? Philosophy is basically about cultivating this sense of smell for the contradictions in the society. So society or people, politicians, anything, any academic disciplines make a certain statement. But then we recognize something out of joint in these statements, and that is the discipline of philosophy. We ask questions, like what are the suppositions, presuppositions, or frameworks in which we make in these statements? We ask this question, how is something is true and beautiful and or good? Basically, a value judgment frames the reality in a certain way. So when we look at world phenomena, we hold in a certain framework, and then you frame them to make it look like beautiful, make it look like ugly, or society, people, or individuals make these value judgments. So philosophers are about asking this framework. What are the frameworks in which we are making this statement that something is beautiful, good, or true, or ugly, false, bad, okay? So philosophy is about the examination of these frameworks, or the ways in which we frame reality. I hope I'm actually giving you some idea of what philosophy is about. And then in the following, I'd like to give you the positive side effect that you can enjoy from studying philosophy. So the positive side effects. First, studying philosophy is an end in itself. What does this mean? First, you have to understand this classical notion of means and ends. So means is the means by which you achieve certain ends. ends are purpose. End in itself is like a purpose in itself. So end in itself is to say that something is not means for something else, but it is the end in itself. Okay, maybe this is not very easy to understand. So think about money. Money is the classical notion of means. It is a means by which you buy something, right? So you earn money so you can buy your flat screen TV. You make money during the summer so that you can actually pay your tuition in college. Money is a means by which you can actually get something else. So philosophers say if you mistake something that is designed as a means, as a purpose, as an end of your life, that is to say, you decided to make money for its own sake. So you decided to actually dedicate yourself to works so that you can become rich, and your whole purpose of life is to become as wealthy as possible, that is to make money. Philosophers argue that by mistaking means as an end, your life as a whole becomes meaningless. It is an ironic situation. If you mistake something that is means or an instrument as the end, you end up losing the sight of what's the whole purpose of getting this means. Does that make sense? So philosophy, unlike money, many philosophers argue is that it's a kind of practice that has a value in its own sake. So practice of philosophy, many philosophers argue, is something valuable in itself, and it is not a means for something else. It is the purpose to which our human life is tending toward. So they say, look, getting to know about the world and everything in the world, but if we don't know about who we are, what's the point of knowledge? Philosophical knowledge or self-examination, self-knowledge is considered to be the highest knowledge to which all different knowledge is attending toward. So they say studying philosophy is an end in itself. Of course, some philosophers argue that everything is just instrumental means for everything else, and there's not such thing as end in itself, but many philosophers disagree with that point by saying that studying philosophy for its own sake has a greatest value. Okay, also philosophy presents the most comprehensive and foundational knowledge. What does this mean? So if you go to university or college, you realize they offer incredible amount of courses, right? So you're bombarded with this list of options. You can take this course, you can take that course. You are presented with many instrumental knowledge, many knowledge that can serve as an instrument, a great instrument for your life success, right? But you're bombarded with these options. And hopefully after studying 4 years and maybe 2 years after 4 years to get a master's degree, you would have this neat workshop. By selecting your tools correctly, and hopefully you're going to have this neat workshop to create something amazing out of your life. Or maybe after spending 4 or 6 years of your life in university, your toolbox looks like this, just the chaos of this different kinds of knowledge that we don't know what to do with it. Whatever the end result of your studying at the university, hopefully you'll be able to navigate and say, I'm going to take this tool, I'm going to take this tool, and we're going to put it together. And that whole process of picking the tools for a certain purpose to drive you to aim at a certain purpose is precisely philosophical move. So studying philosophy is like selecting these tools to make a certain product. It aims to give you a kind of orientation from the most comprehensive standpoint. So that's the whole point of studying philosophy. Also, philosophy can provide you a very enriched experience of life. So for instance, imagine you go into this beautiful forest. You know nothing about anything. You go into this forest. It's great. It's beautiful. But imagine if you had a knowledge of biology, especially if you walk to this forest with a botanist. Can you imagine the richness or wealth of experience? If you have a great knowledge of plants and see this world, your experience is much more enriched, right? Or examine seeing the stars at night. If you know nothing about astronomy, this just looks like beautiful, but that's about it. But if you're hanging out with astronomists, they can tell you many things about these stars, and your experience of the universe will be different. Again, not all knowledge of astronomy has practical applications, right? Knowing about black hole might not give you a job. Knowing about stars might not feed your family. But knowing about the stars and looking at them, your world and your experience of the starry night is entirely different. Or imagine going to this garden with an artist. Can you imagine the experience of going to this garden with the artist, and they're going to present to you how beautiful this garden is. So it's a simple experience, but knowing something extra, your experience is entirely different. I think we can say the same thing about engineering or architecture, right? Sometimes you look at the amazing piece of engineering, but we only know the instrumental function of them. But if you talk to the engineers, they can tell you more about the machine. And if you go to a building that is ugly or strange looking buildings, but if you talk to architect, they can tell you many interesting things about these structures. In the same way, philosophy is a comprehensive enrichment of life experience. So, unlike any other particular disciplines that focus on one specific object of study, philosophers are capable of talking to any specialist and talk about these wonders. So we can talk to astronomers, we can talk to engineers, we can talk to artists. So we have a topic like philosophy of technology, aesthetics, philosophy of biology, so on and so forth. So philosophers can share these enriched experience with all the other specialists. Okay, maybe these are too idealistic for you. So you want to say like, I want to know what can I do with the philosophy degree after I graduate from philosophy program. And I'm going to give you this simple pep talk to study philosophy. Philosophy is actually a great means as well. I have many friends study philosophy with me, undergraduate, master's degree, PhD. Some of them decided to study something else after studying philosophy. So they became doctors, they became lawyers, and they are very successful lawyers and doctors. And if you talk to them about the experience of studying philosophy, many of them would say that, yeah, it was very intellectually challenging, but it really prepared me to go into these other disciplines like law or medicine. So if you want to become a very self-critical thinker and someone who can think about things beyond the given framework, philosophy is a great discipline to train your mind. So it is also, it is an in itself, it has a value for its own sake. But if you want to use it as a means for something else, I'm just saying that it's a great means. Lastly, I would like to emphasize this point. Philosophy is the best place to cultivate the best kind of friendship. What do I mean by this? First, I would like to mention this classical notion of friendship. So some friends are fun to hang out with, right? And some friends, you're friends with them because they have instrumental values. He helped me with this project, so I help him with that project. Kind of instrumental relationship. But best kind of friend are the friends that is there for you no matter what, right? So the friendship for its own sake. That is the best kind of friendship. But in order for you to cultivate that kind of friendship, it's the best for you to cultivate this worldview that something can be practiced for its own sake. So if you practice philosophy for its own sake, it's really easy for you to cultivate that kind of friendship, I think. Also, another element that helps us have this very intimate friendship that can last for your lifetime, it's because of this. Philosophers are voracious readers. We read many books. We have incredible library. You know, sometimes you meet somebody who went through the exact life experience in different parts of the world, and you meet that person for the first time, but it feels like you know that person forever. Or you meet somebody for the first time, but they read exactly the same books a few months ago, and both of you loved the same book, and then you started to talk to each other and realize that you click. Like it feels like we are like soulmates. I think philosophy does that. Philosophy books are basically people who lived in the past, thought about these life problems, they spend their lifetime to write them. So it's about their life experience squeezed into this little book, and you spend time with them for weeks. In those weeks, you can actually gain experience of lifetime or a kind of insight that you'll be able to cultivate from living a life. So imagine reading all these books and you cultivating this sense of what you like and what you don't like, and you meet each other for the first time with this capacity to acknowledge that something can be done for its own sake beyond instrumental monetary value. You're going to make great friends. You're going to talk with them for hours. It doesn't matter, the economy is doing horrible, world is going to pandemic. We can still maintain this capacity to talk to each other, care about each other. And you have a very strong connection that you'll be able to cultivate from studying philosophy. So that would be something that I would really like to mention. If you want to make a friend of lifetime that has this great connection, philosophy is definitely the place to look for. And then some of them might actually become lawyers and doctors, so that's great, right? So that's something that I would like to recommend you to think about when you think about taking philosophy classes. And of course, I'm pretty sure that I'm not answering all the questions that you have. This is just to start the conversation about what's the value of studying philosophy, or why should we actually study philosophy. So if you have any questions, questions for clarification or questions for what kind of philosophy you want to take for what purpose, I'm happy to answer to these specific questions. And I hope I answered Paul's question to his satisfaction and his students will be benefited from this video. Okay, if you made it this far, you should definitely like this video, and also if you are interested in philosophy, please subscribe to this channel, Takeshi's Bench. If you have any questions about philosophy or comments, arguments, and ideas on all things philosophical, please send them to us through comments below. We will try to pick some of them for the future episodes. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.